October 12, 1997. The New Mexico desert seemed to be experiencing one of its most common nights. A clear sky, silent streets, the calm breathing of a small town resting under the weight of the stars. But at 10:37 p.m. everything changed. First, the sudden darkness, as if all the lights, televisions and radios had been switched off by a single invisible hand. Shortly after, a brightness cut across the horizon. And high above, in the cosmic void, lights began to move in patterns no plane or satellite could replicate. You can imagine the scene. Entire families rushing out of their homes, neighbors shouting each other's names, dogs howling as if they sensed a visitor that human eyes couldn't decipher. The sky became a stage for triangular shapes that moved in absolute silence, as if gliding between the stars. There was no engine, no sound, just the vibration in the chest of every person who dared to look at those lights. The accounts describe a mix of panic and fascination. Children clinging to their parents' legs, not comprehending the grandeur of what they were seeing. Elders murmuring in a low voice, "I've witnessed something like this before," as if that night wasn't an accident, but the repetition of an ancient cycle. A call that always returned to test who was ready to see. Time seemed distorted. Some claimed that seconds stretched into endless minutes, while others swore they lost entire hours that night without being able to explain how. And it is precisely in this void of answers that the mystery grows. What really happened on October 12, 1997? Now I ask you, what if on that night they weren't just observing, but choosing? What if those lights weren't just a distant spectacle, but a directed gaze, scanning every face, every mind, every soul, in search of something most of us don't even know we carry? This question still echoes today. Because when a phenomenon takes hold so intensely, it's not just a coincidence. It's an invitation that separates those who continue to live as if nothing happened, and those who can never erase from their memory the moment they felt they were in the presence of something greater than any government, religion, or science could explain. New Mexico went to sleep differently that dawn, because those who saw it never forgot, and those who didn't still feel the strange sensation of having missed the moment when history was almost rewritten before our eyes. You need to go back with me to that night, because nothing that happened can be understood without the intensity of the first moments. The clock read a little after 10 at night when the first reports began to spread. In different neighborhoods, with no connection between them, entire families were torn from their routines and brought to the same point of attention, the sky. It was as if an invisible force had activated everyone at the same time, calling them out of their homes. The silence that followed the blackout was not a natural silence. It wasn't like when the power goes out in a city and all that's left is the sound of crickets or the night wind. It was a heavy, dense, suffocating silence, as if even the air had been held back. Breathing seemed to be more difficult, and many later described feeling a pressure in their chest, as if their very heart was trapped in a magnetic field. Then the lights appeared. 3 brilliant points that aligned in the sky, forming a perfect triangle. They moved in sync, effortlessly, with a smoothness no human vehicle could imitate. Shortly after, other points lit up, crossing the horizon with absurd speed, disappearing and reappearing in fractions of a second, as if space had no limits for them. Radios began to buzz. Televisions that were still on before the blackout only came back with distorted images, colored lines that obeyed no channel. Drivers trapped on deserted roads reported that their cars suddenly shut down, as if they had lost their vital energy. The fear began to take shape when they realized that nothing was working. On that night, children ran crying into their parents' arms, saying they saw figures next to the lights. The elders, those who had lived through wars and witnessed decades of transformations, repeated in a grave tone, "This has happened before. They have returned," but no one could explain who they were or why they would have come back. Then came the first disappearances. A couple driving down a secondary road vanished before the eyes of another driver. The car remained on the asphalt, but the two occupants were simply no longer there. Minutes later, they reappeared in the identical position, as if nothing had happened, but with no memory whatsoever of what they had seen or felt. Their expressions, however, betrayed the inexplicable. Lost looks, dilated pupils, trembling throughout their bodies. The news of these disappearances spread quickly through the city. People who had previously only been curious were now filled with terror. What were those lights? What did they want? Why did they seem to choose certain people and not others? With every passing minute, the feeling grew. This was not a casual spectacle in the sky, but a meticulous selection. And you, upon hearing this narrative, can feel the anguish of being there. Imagine yourself in the middle of that crowd, looking up, trying to find a rational explanation. Sweaty hands, a dry throat, a chill running down your spine. Suddenly, you realize that it's not you who is observing the phenomenon, but that the phenomenon seems to be observing you. Many residents claim to have the distinct sensation of being swept by an invisible beam, as if every thought was being probed, as if their memories were being opened and examined. The terror came not only from what they saw, but from what they felt inside their own minds. The atmosphere that began with admiration transformed into pure fear. With each report, the conviction grew that something bigger was happening, something that surpassed human understanding. It wasn't just a flying object, it was a summons the night wore on. And New Mexico ceased to be just a dot on the map to become the stage for a story that would forever change the lives of those who witnessed it. The days following that night in New Mexico were not ordinary. The city woke up with a suspicious silence, as if each resident carried a secret they didn't know how to put into words. Local headlines tried to treat the episode as a sudden blackout or an unusual atmospheric phenomenon, but no one believed it. You know when the explanation doesn't hold the weight of what was seen. And that morning, what lingered was not doubt, but the certainty that something beyond comprehension had happened. Independent researchers began to arrive from other regions. Ufologists carrying old cameras, recorders, and notebooks. Retired ex-military men, serious-looking men who had already lived through situations where the inexplicable was masked as training or technical failure. They knew they had to move quickly before the story was buried under layers of official silence. Interviews with witnesses revealed a pattern. Circular marks appeared in open field areas, burned into the soil as if an invisible force had pressed the earth with millimeter precision. Animals were found dead with no signs of struggle, but with a metallic smell clinging to the air, like ozone or burnt iron. Residents reported that the leaves on the trees were parched, brittle, even without any fire or heat that could justify it. One of the most striking stories came from a lonely farmer. He said that on that night he saw a small triangular craft landed in his field. The object emitted a soft, almost hypnotic glow, and around it were humanoid figures that didn't walk like us. The farmer described that they seemed to slide over the earth, and each of their movements left a luminous trail behind, as if reality wasn't able to fully contain them. The man swore he wasn't dreaming, wasn't drunk, and had never in his life felt so much fear and reverence at the same time. And then came the testimony that transformed the investigation into something even more somber. A mother with a choked voice told how on that night her son, just 8 years old, was attracted by the lights. He left the house alone, as if guided by a voice that only he could hear. She searched for him frantically, shouting in the yard, running down the road. But the boy had simply vanished. Minutes later he appeared lying on the lawn, motionless, as if he had fallen asleep in seconds. When he woke up, he remembered nothing. He just said he dreamed of rooms of light and voices that spoke without a mouth. This account deeply affected the investigators. It was no longer just a question of lights in the sky or broken electronic devices. Now there were children involved, families destroyed by the fear that it could happen again. Empathy took hold of everyone who heard that mother's story. and each person put themselves in her place, feeling the anguish of not being able to protect a loved one from something they couldn't see, understand, or control. Every day, more evidence emerged, but at the same time, more attempts at silencing appeared. Local authorities denied access to certain areas. Reports mysteriously disappeared, and journalists who dared to insist on the subject were quickly silenced. It was as if a larger shadow wanted to bury the truth before it could spread, but the truth had already spread. Each witness carried the memory of that night within them. And even if they tried to erase the official records, what was recorded in people's hearts could not be silenced. The whole city knew it had been observed, touched, and in a way chosen. And now I ask you, what if this had happened in your city, to your family, to someone you love? What would you do? Would you remain silent, trying to forget? Or would you seek to understand what really happened, even if it meant challenging everything you believed about the world? Before we continue, if this video is being useful to you, take this moment to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment below what you would do if you witnessed something like this in your city. This helps the message reach more people. Among all the accounts of that night in 1997, none touched as deeply as the story of a family that became the heart of the investigation. You've heard of many testimonies, but this one carries a different weight because it's not just about lights, symbols, or unknown materials. It's about blood, about bonds, about what it means to see your own life torn from normalcy and transformed into a living enigma. She was a simple mother, a resident of a small wooden house on the outskirts of the city. That night, she lost her 8-year-old son for minutes that seemed like an eternity. You remember, he was found lying on the lawn, as if he had fallen asleep under a luminous spell. Well, days later, the inexplicable returned with even more force. The boy disappeared again, but this time not for minutes. It was for entire days. The whole city went into a panic. Searches were conducted in forests, rivers, roads. Men took turns day and night, but there were no clues. For the mother, time seemed to have stopped, and the anguish was like a knife stuck in her soul. Then, as suddenly as he had disappeared, the boy returned. He was at home, sitting on the same lawn where he had been found before. No scratches, no signs of hunger or thirst. The disturbing detail: he didn't seem to have aged a single second, as if time had not touched his body. But his eyes were no longer the same. There was a new depth, as if they carried memories that did not belong to a child. The first signs of this transformation came in words. The boy began to speak disconnected sentences in languages he had never studied, languages that neither his mother nor the neighbors recognized. Researchers recorded his speech and sent it to linguists, who were perplexed. Part of what he said sounded like fragments of ancient Aramaic. Another part resembled sounds from Sanskrit, and there were still patterns that did not correspond to any known human language. But the most impressive were his descriptions. He spoke of rooms of light, where there was no ceiling, walls, or floor, just a white immensity where beings received him. He said they didn't walk, but moved like thoughts, appearing and disappearing in space. In his words, they were figures with large eyes that showed the future of the earth as if it were an open book. Can you feel the impact of this? Imagine being this mother, hearing her son report that he saw images of the world flooded by seas, cities in flames, crowds running in despair, and then suddenly green fields, crystal clear waters, and people living in peace, as if two versions of the future were being shown at the same time. The boy said that the beings called him a witness, that he had been chosen not by chance, but because he carried something within him that would still awaken. He didn't know how to explain what it was, but he claimed that the fate of many depended on what he would do when he grew up. This family's drama became a symbol for everyone in the city. It wasn't just a distant story, it was a real link that connected the cosmic mystery to the human heart. And here, you need to put yourself in her place. What if it were your son? What if it were your daughter who was taken, to disappear amid the lights and return transformed by experiences you could never comprehend? What would you do? Would you try to forget, hide, deny, or would you accept that your own family was touched by something greater than this world can explain? This family link forever changed the way residents viewed that phenomenon. It was no longer about objects, sounds, or marks. It was about people. It was about the fine line between the unknown and the intimate, between the cosmic and the domestic, between the stars and the blood that runs in our veins. And in that instant, everyone understood a silent truth. The visitors weren't just testing machines, nor were they studying the planet. They were looking at us, choosing from within our own homes, from within our families, those who would carry a role in the future of humanity. The city was still recovering from the shock when, weeks later, the impossible happened again. The sky, which seemed to have rested since the night of October 12th, was again torn by signs that could not be mistaken for anything terrestrial. But this time, they were not just distant lights, nor triangles that moved in silence. It was something more intense, closer, more palpable. On that night, hundreds of people reported the same phenomenon, a deep, grave sound that didn't come from any specific direction, but seemed to vibrate inside the body. It wasn't just heard with the ears, but felt in the bones, in the chest, in the soul. Those who were awake described that the vibration made the ground tremble slightly, but in a way that seemed to respond to the very heart of the listener. Those who were asleep were awakened by strange and intense dreams, as if voices were calling from within their minds. When people ran out of their homes, the spectacle had already formed. Over the mountains and deserts of New Mexico, dozens of ships hovered, arranged in geometric patterns. It was not a disordered flight. They were precise formations, almost military, but with a beauty that defied human logic. Each ship emitted a pulsating light that expanded and receded, as if breathing along with the city. Witnesses reported that the air seemed denser, charged with static electricity. Hair stood on end, radios exploded in static, dogs barked non-stop. But the fear that had dominated the first night gave way to something different, a feeling that the return was not a threat, but a continuation. As if they had come to conclude something they had started. And it is at this point that the narrative reaches its climax. People began to feel uncontrollable physical effects in their bodies. Heat in their hands, pressure in their forehead, palpitations in their chest, as if they were being activated from the inside out. Many reported that when they closed their eyes, they saw luminous symbols floating, symbols that coincided with those engraved on the metallic fragments found earlier. Others said they heard voices repeating unknown words, but which brought peace instead of terror. Among the most striking testimonies was again that of the boy who had disappeared. He entered a trance in front of dozens of neighbors and began to repeat phrases in an incomprehensible language. His voice was firm, deep, too mature for an 8-year-old. In the middle of those strange words, there were intervals when he said in simple Portuguese, "They are here to guide." They returned because the choice needs to be concluded. This moment sealed the residents' conviction. The visitors were not just observing. They were interacting, influencing, leaving clear signs that there was a greater purpose in their presence. It was no longer possible to deny. It was no longer possible to reduce it to collective hysteria or individual illusions. It was real, visible, palpable, and it left marks that could not be erased. And you, listening to this story, need to ask yourself, what would you do if you saw dozens of ships hovering over your city, organized as if drawing a message in the very sky? Would you continue to say it's just a coincidence? Or would you surrender to the evidence that contact is not a distant future, but an absolute present? The climax of that sequence of nights made it clear that the visitors were not bound by scientific curiosity. They guided, they chose, they interfered with the human heart directly, transforming fear into reverence, doubt into conviction, silence into a message, And when the last ship disappeared, gliding beyond the stars, everyone knew that was not the end but a milestone, a chapter of a story that was just beginning. What would follow would forever change not just that city, but the destiny of all humanity. After the visitors' return, the city was never the same. What was once spoken in whispers came to be seen as inevitable. Each resident carried within them the memory of something that could not be explained, but that forever changed the way they saw the world. The initial fear gave way to a strange sense of mission, as if each one had been summoned for a purpose they didn't yet fully comprehend. The strongest link to this understanding came again from the boy. He, who had already disappeared and returned, began to speak more clearly about what he had seen during the time he was gone. According to him, the visitors did not present themselves as enemies, but as guides. They said they had always been here, accompanying humanity since its first steps, but that they only revealed themselves more explicitly at decisive moments. He said he was taken to places he described as timeless rooms, where there was no past, present, or future, just projected images of possibilities. In these places, they showed him that humanity was at a crossroads. One path led to destruction, the other to a leap in consciousness. And that, to tread the path of light, it would be necessary to prepare some, chosen from among us, to carry messages and awaken the others. This account deeply resonated with researchers and residents. The boy no longer spoke like a child, but like someone who had crossed an invisible threshold. His words carried weight, as if they didn't just come from him. He claimed that the visitors choose human representatives not by chance, but by patterns they recognize in the soul, invisible marks that indicate who can bear the burden of seeing and transmitting what is beyond common understanding. And here is the catharsis: to understand that it was not just a mysterious night, but a collective call. The signs of 1997, the lights, the disappearances, the sounds, all were part of a preparation. The true enigma was not whether they existed, but why now? Why there? Why those people? Scholars began to relate these events to ancient accounts, sightings described in religious texts, indigenous legends that spoke of star people, myths of gods who descend in fiery chariots. The boy said they were all them, the same visitors, adapted to the time, language, and culture of each generation. Always the same, always present, always veiled. Can you perceive the power of this? It means that the signs were not just in the sky in 1997, but throughout all of human history. That the myths were not just fantasies, but fragmented records of previous encounters. And that night in New Mexico was not an accident, but a piece of a cosmic mosaic that is beginning to reveal itself. For many, this revelation brought dread. After all, if they choose, it means there are criteria we don't understand. And maybe not everyone is destined to be part of this future. But for others it brought hope, because the choice was not punishment, but mission. It was proof that we are not alone, that we are part of something bigger, that humanity has a role in a cosmic drama far beyond what we can imagine. And here, I ask you the same question that echoed in that city. What if it's no longer a question of believing or not believing? What if the real question is, when will they decide to reveal themselves for good, on a global scale, without veils, without shadows, before everyone? The catharsis of that people was to realize that the answer did not depend only on them, but on us. That maybe every look at the sky, every feeling of being watched, every strange dream is part of a larger process of preparation. That contact is no longer if, but when. And deep down, this feeling of being watched, that there is something beyond the stars accompanying us, is not just imagination. It is the echo of the same story, repeated in different eras, calling you to realize that the future will not be decided only by governments or science, but by every soul that awakens to the truth. What happened on October 12, 1997 cannot be reduced to a mysterious blackout or mere rumors from a small desert town. What was experienced that night was a rehearsal for contact, a premonition of something bigger, a memory that never left the skin, the mind, and the soul of those who witnessed it. You heard it. The lights, the disappearances, the return marked by symbols, the child who returned transformed, the bodies that vibrated to the sound of the ships, the telepathic messages that spoke of choices and the future. None of these elements, in isolation, would explain the magnitude of the event. But together, they form a revelation impossible to erase. Humanity has already been touched, has already been observed, has already been chosen. And here is the most uncomfortable truth. Maybe they never left. Maybe they never needed to arrive, because they have always been here, hidden from human eyes, just waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves without disguises. Maybe every star you look at in the sky is not just a star. Maybe every shadow that crosses the corner of your vision is more than imagination. So I ask you, what if they are already here, walking among us, waiting for humanity to mature, to accept them fully? And what if the signs, the ancient stories, the myths, and the mysterious nights are just fragments of the same story? A story that is now approaching its climax. What happened in 1997 was just the first visible chapter of a book that is still being written. And you now are part of this plot, because hearing this story is more than curiosity. It is to assume that the truth can no longer be hidden, that the revelation can no longer be suppressed, that humanity needs to be ready. Therefore, keep your eyes alert, your mind open, and your heart prepared. Because when the next sign comes, it will no longer be to test, but to conclude. And at that moment, the only question that will remain will be, were you ready to accept the truth? If you believe that humanity has already had real contact with beings from other worlds, subscribe to the channel now, activate the notification bell, and share this video. Together, we will take this message to more people and open the eyes of the world to the truth that can no longer be hidden.